3 months after my boss replaced me with his unqualified daughter, federal compliance investigators walked into our Chicago headquarters at 8:14 on a Tuesday morning, carrying subpoenas tied to a $250 million biotech account. The same executives who called me old-fashioned and replaceable suddenly started blaming each other after one reckless email exposed confidential merger material, triggered a regulatory investigation, and destroyed the biggest client in company history. By the end of that week, careers were over, legal teams were sleeping in conference rooms, and the woman they mocked for being too quiet was the only person not under investigation. My name is Claire Ashford, and this is the revenge story of how corporate arrogance, nepotism, and greed burned an empire to the ground. Chapter 1. The day they handed my life's work to a woman who thought compliance was a personality trait. Gregory Halbert waited until everyone started leaving the executive strategy meeting before he came over to my desk. That alone told me whatever he was about to say had already been discussed behind closed doors. The glass conference room behind him was still full of half-empty coffee cups and glowing laptop screens. Outside the windows, downtown Chicago looked gray and frozen under a January sky that hadn't seen sunlight in days. Gregory leaned one hand against the edge of my desk and gave me the same polished smile he used on clients right before he lied to them. Lila will be taking over Westbridge moving forward. That was it. No warning, no conversation, no thank you for the last 7 years of my life. Just one sentence. He said it casually, too, like he was switching social media coordinators instead of handing a $250 million enterprise account to his daughter. For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. Then I noticed Lila standing near the hallway, pretending to check something on her phone while trying not to smile. That was the moment I realized this had been planned for a while. I looked around the office. Nobody made eye contact with me. Not finance, not operations, not even Melissa from marketing, who once called me the only reason Westbridge hadn't fired us during the integration disaster 2 years ago. Everyone suddenly found their screens fascinating. Corporate America has a special way of going silent when a woman is being pushed aside, especially a woman over 40, especially one who spent years making everybody else look competent. I opened my desk drawer slowly and pulled out my company phone. Every secure thread with Westbridge was inside it. Every executive contact, every late-night escalation, every emergency conference call I handled while Gregory slept peacefully somewhere in the suburbs. I placed the phone in his hand. Everything's in there. Gregory looked relieved, like he expected me to cry or yell or make some emotional speech about loyalty. Instead, he gave me a sympathetic nod that somehow felt more insulting than the replacement itself. You've done a great job keeping things stable, Tareen, but clients respond to fresh energy. Fresh energy. I almost laughed, because 2 months earlier, his daughter asked me what B2B actually stood for during a client prep call. She thought EBITDA was software, and now she had fresh energy? Gregory walked away before I answered. Lila finally looked up from her phone and gave me a small smile that was supposed to feel supportive. I really want us to collaborate through this transition. Transition. That word stayed in my head the rest of the afternoon. Not replacement, not removal, transition. The kind of word executives use when they want something ugly to sound strategic. 3 months earlier, none of this looked dangerous yet. Annoying, yes. Dangerous, no. At the time, I thought Gregory was just trying to create a leadership position for his daughter before the next board cycle. I had no idea he was about to destroy his own company doing it. My name is Corrine Vale Mercer. I was 44 years old that winter, and for 7 years, I ran the largest account at Halcyon Strategic Group. Westbridge Dynamics wasn't just another client. It was the account. The one everybody bragged about during investor meetings, the one finance built forecasts around, the one Gregory loved mentioning whenever he talked about company growth. I practically lived inside that contract. I flew between Chicago and Boston so often that airline employees recognized me by name. I once spent 36 straight hours inside a freezing server room in Newark helping stabilize a failed predictive analytics rollout because the engineering team panicked and nobody else understood the client well enough to calm them down. Another time, I rewrote an entire renewal proposal at 3 in the morning after Gregory accidentally sent outdated pricing models to Westbridge procurement. The next week, he accepted congratulations from the board for protecting the relationship. That was always how it worked. I handled disasters, Gregory handled visibility. People called me reliable all the time. Reliable is corporate language for a woman they plan to overwork forever. Then, Lila arrived. She entered Halcyon with expensive pastel blazers, perfectly styled hair, and the confidence of someone who'd never once worried about consequences. Everything about her felt rehearsed. She spoke entirely in executive buzzwords: cross-functional alignment, brand synergy, leadership energy, collaborative visibility. During her second week, she added emojis to a client folder connected to Westbridge integration planning. A week later, she scheduled an executive call using Pacific time instead of Eastern and left half the Boston team waiting online for 40 minutes. Gregory laughed it off. She's learning. That became his answer for everything. When she forwarded internal notes to the wrong department, when she interrupted senior engineers in meetings, when she used the phrase energy alignment during a conversation about regulatory compliance. Meanwhile, little things around me started changing. I stopped getting copied on recurring client emails. My calendar permissions changed without warning. Lila suddenly appeared inside Slack channels that should have required executive approval. One afternoon, Selena Ortiz from operations stopped beside my desk holding 2 coffees. Greg seriously thinks she can run Westbridge? It wasn't really a question. I remember looking at Selena and realizing she felt nervous too. Not for me, for the account. A few days later, Jalen Brooks wandered past my office and casually mentioned the transition portal Lila had already started updating. I stared at him. Transition portal. Nobody had informed me there even was one. That night, I drove home through freezing traffic along Lakeshore Drive, feeling strangely numb. My condo was quiet, except for the heater clicking against the cold. Around midnight, my laptop chimed with a new email. The subject line said, "Next chapter." Lila wrote 3 cheerful paragraphs about carrying my incredible legacy forward. I read it twice. Then I opened another file. A private non-disclosure agreement signed 3 years ago between Robert Fielding, the CEO of Westbridge, Dynamics, not Halcyon, me. I entered the password and stared at clause 3A. No third-party communication without written consent. I sat there for a long time looking at those words. Gregory thought he replaced an employee that morning. What he actually did was hand the most sensitive client relationship in the company to the one person reckless enough to destroy it. The atmosphere inside Halcyon started changing in ways people pretended not to notice. Nobody said anything directly at first. That is how these places work. A woman spends years holding everything together, then one day the room quietly decides she has become part of the furniture. Within a couple weeks, Gregory started bringing Lila into meetings that used to belong to me: executive dinners, investor prep sessions, private strategy calls with Westbridge. Every time she walked into one of those rooms beside him, she carried herself like someone who had already been promised the future. One Tuesday morning, we had a strategy sync with finance, operations, and the Westbridge integration team. I got there early like I always did, printed notes, risk projections, updated rollout timelines. Then Gregory walked in with Lila behind him. He pointed toward the chair beside him. "Take this seat." My seat. Lila smiled awkwardly before sitting down. Nobody looked at me while I moved farther down the table. I could actually feel the discomfort in the room. Papers shifting, coffee cups moving, people pretending to read emails. Halfway through the meeting, Gregory leaned back in his chair and said something that made even finance stop typing. "Corinne has done an incredible job keeping this relationship stable over the years, but clients respond to younger leadership now." Younger leadership. There it was. Not experience, not judgment, not the fact that I had spent 7 years protecting the largest account in the company. Fresh faces, fresh energy, younger leadership. Lila glanced toward me so fast I almost missed it. Even she knew that sounded ugly. I kept my face neutral while my stomach slowly tightened, because the worst part was not Gregory saying it. The worst part was nobody challenging him, not Melissa from marketing, not finance, not operations. Everybody just sat there letting it happen. I spent years saving Gregory from disasters he caused himself. 3 years ago, he accidentally sent outdated pricing structures to Westbridge procurement less than 12 hours before renewal review. I stayed awake until almost 4 in the morning rebuilding the entire proposal from scratch while Gregory sent motivational emails about teamwork. Another time, he ignored engineering warnings during a predictive analytics rollout and nearly triggered a client escalation serious enough to reach investors. I flew to Boston on almost no sleep and spent 2 days calming executives while Gregory gave polished updates from Chicago. Every single time we survived one of his mistakes, he stood in front of the board afterwards, smiling like a man who had personally rescued the company. Our leadership team delivered. That sentence used to make me tired. Now it made me angry. Meanwhile, Lila kept getting more access than she should have. One afternoon, I opened a shared archive and saw she had renamed one of the restricted roadmap folders with decorative icons and color labels. I walked straight to her office. "You cannot change archive labeling on compliance files." She looked up from her laptop with that same calm confidence people have when they've never really been punished for anything. I was trying to make the system feel less intimidating. "These are legal documents, not social media templates." Her expression hardened immediately. "You don't have to talk to me like I'm stupid." The strange thing was, I honestly do not think Lila believed she was underqualified. She thought people like me were outdated. That made her dangerous. A few days later, Melissa Grant stormed into my office carrying a printed presentation deck. "Tell me this isn't going to the board." I flipped through the pages and felt cold almost immediately. Lila had redesigned a confidential strategy presentation using bright Canva graphics that looked like an ad for a wellness startup. Buried inside the slides was language pulled directly from restricted roadmap discussions tied to Westbridge predictive analytics expansion. Where did she get this wording? Melissa crossed her arms. "That's exactly what I asked her." Later that afternoon, Evan Pierce from Data Integration stopped beside my desk. "Why does she even have access to roadmap material?" I looked through the grass walls toward Gregory's office. "Because Gregory thinks confidence and competence are interchangeable." Evan gave a quiet laugh, but it died fast. "This is going to blow up." By then, people around the company had started whispering. Executives lowered their voices whenever Westbridge came up. Finance kept asking questions about account continuity. Operations quietly routed technical issues back to me instead of Lila. One afternoon, I stepped off the elevator and overheard someone near the lobby say, "Losing Corinne on this account feels reckless." Not risky, reckless. That word stayed with me. Naomi Leclerc from Compliance began sending more emails asking whether legal review had been completed before the transition. Kathleen Bishop stopped Gregory outside a board prep meeting while I was walking past. Did council approve this reassignment? Gregory barely slowed down. "Kathleen, we are not preparing for a Senate investigation." She watched him walk away with an expression that told me she was no longer comfortable. Neither was I. That night, I kept thinking about a call with Robert Fielding almost 2 years ago. He had been standing inside Zurich Airport waiting for a delayed flight when we discussed firewall protections connected to a confidential acquisition. Near the end of the conversation, his voice changed. "If roadmap language leaks before legal clearance, this stops being a business problem." At the time, I thought he meant lawsuits. Now I realized he meant consequences much bigger than that. The following week, Gregory officially announced Lila as primary client lead for Westbridge Dynamics. Nobody clapped. Nobody even looked surprised anymore. After the meeting, Gregory stopped beside my desk. "We'll still need your support during the transition." "Of course you will," I said. Because deep down, even Gregory understood something his ego would never let him admit out loud. Lila could inherit my title, she could not inherit the trust behind it. I placed my company phone on the desk between us. Lila picked it up carefully with both hands, like someone accepting an award on stage. I'm excited to bring a fresh perspective to the client experience. Fresh perspective. I watched her walk away holding 7 years of relationships she did not understand and confidential systems she definitely should not have been touching. That should have been my final warning. Later that night, I sat alone in my condo, reading through the non-disclosure agreement again. This time, I focused on Appendix C, merger firewall restrictions, strategic roadmap classifications, protected communication protocols. The deeper I read, the worse the feeling in my chest became. Then, my laptop chimed softly beside me. A new notification appeared across the screen. Lila Helbert had just emailed Robert Fielding directly.
Chapter 3. The email that quietly started destroying everything. I kept staring at Lila's email long after the screen dimmed. Big, exciting energy ahead. Even the subject line sounded exhausting. I opened the message anyway. Inside were 3 paragraphs of fake executive enthusiasm, filled with exclamation points, leadership buzzwords, and an invitation for a virtual matcha chat with Robert Fielding. A matcha chat with a man who once terminated a consulting contract because someone misspelled acquisition in a confidential investor packet. I leaned back slowly in my kitchen chair and rubbed my eyes. Then I laughed under my breath because suddenly the entire situation stopped feeling insulting and started feeling dangerous. Outside my condo window, Lakeshore Drive was glowing with wet headlights under freezing rain. It was almost midnight, and I could not remember how many cups of coffee I had already consumed that day. The exhaustion had settled deep into my body by then, the kind that makes your shoulders ache even when you are sitting still. For 7 years, I had been the only person at Halcyon trusted with direct access to Westbridge roadmap firewall materials. Not Gregory, not legal, not finance. Me. Because Robert Fielding did not care about job titles or executive charm. He cared about discretion. That was why the memory of our conversation in 2022 kept replaying in my head. Back then, a smaller biotech vendor accidentally leaked integration language tied to a confidential predictive diagnostics acquisition. The information stayed public for less than 20 minutes before lawyers buried it, but the damage was already done. Investor forums noticed unusual stock movement almost immediately. Robert called me personally that night. Not the company, not Gregory, me. I still remember hearing airport announcements echoing behind him while he waited for a delayed flight in Zurich. If roadmap language leaks before legal clearance, this stops being a business problem. At the time, I thought he meant lawsuits. Now I realized he meant panic. The next morning, Halcyon felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, quiet in the way hospitals feel at 3 in the morning. People lowered their voices when I walked by. Conference rooms stayed occupied late into the evening. Slack notifications kept firing non-stop across the office, while executives suddenly started requesting extra forecasting reviews connected to Westbridge. Nobody openly admitted there was a problem yet, but everybody could feel one growing. Melissa Grant caught me near the elevators carrying a stack of presentation drafts against her chest. Please tell me she didn't send this deck yet. I took the papers from her and immediately felt my stomach tighten. Lila had redesigned a confidential strategy presentation using bright, polished graphics that looked more appropriate for a luxury skincare launch than a biotech infrastructure briefing. Buried inside the slides were phrases pulled directly from protected roadmap discussions. Predictive blood analytics expansion, integrated acquisition alignment, cross-market infrastructure roadmap, restricted language. My pulse started climbing. Where did she get this? Melissa looked genuinely nervous. She said Gregory approved everything. Of course he did. That afternoon, I walked past one of the smaller conference rooms and noticed Naomi LeClaire from Compliance reviewing archive access logs with Parker Wynn from Legal. Nobody from Compliance normally worked Fridays that late. Naomi barely glanced up at me before lowering her voice toward Parker.
If these slides circulated outside authorization, this becomes exposure. Exposure. That word followed me around for the rest of the day. The worst part was Gregory still acted completely relaxed. During an executive sync, he actually smiled while Leela gave updates about client engagement strategy, like she'd been managing enterprise relationships for years instead of months. Westbridge is responding really well to the fresh direction. Fresh direction. I looked around the room while she talked. Nobody believed her. Not operations, not finance, not even marketing anymore. But corporate environments are built on survival, not honesty. People sensed danger and started protecting themselves quietly. One by one, they began distancing themselves from her. Operations rerouted technical questions back to me without explaining why. Marketing stopped inviting Leela to late-stage review discussions. Finance started asking subtle questions about contingency planning if Westbridge became unstable. Even the office itself felt different. Lights stayed on later at night. Hallways felt emptier. People stopped lingering near break rooms. Everybody moved faster, spoke softer, avoided eye contact longer. One evening, I walked into the kitchen area just as two executives stopped talking mid-sentence. The silence after that hurt more than anything Gregory had said to me directly. One of them gave me an awkward smile before leaving with her coffee. The other stared at the counter. Nobody defended me. Nobody warned me. Nobody even asked if I was all right. That's when I realized something ugly about corporate loyalty. People will absolutely watch you drown if they think the water might spread toward them next. Around that same time, Aaron Whittemore from a biotech consulting firm in Boston emailed me again. Still interested in talking? For the first time, I answered. Possibly. That night, I updated my resume sitting alone at my dining table while Chicago traffic glowed outside the windows. Then I started organizing documentation from the last 7 years, client escalation records, approval timelines, emergency rollout summaries, access permissions. I told myself I was simply being careful. Deep down, I think I already knew Halcyon was beginning to collapse underneath the surface. Monday morning started with another strange feeling in my chest. The office looked normal, too normal. Gregory was laughing near reception. Leela walked through the hallway carrying coffee like she had already secured her promotion permanently. But compliance was suddenly everywhere. Naomi and Parker were reviewing board deck histories before 8 in the morning. Finance requested updated exposure estimates connected to Westbridge. Legal assistants moved in and out of conference rooms carrying binders thicker than bullets. Then came the moment that finally made my hands stop moving over my keyboard. Leela was standing near marketing discussing expansion strategy with 2 junior associates when she casually mentioned confidential acquisition language out loud. Not enough details to fully expose anything, but enough. Enough to make my stomach drop. At that point, the damage probably had already started spreading through the building. I just didn't know how far yet. Around noon, my inbox refreshed. One new email. No subject line, no greeting, just one sentence. Are you still under NDA? Robert Fielding. I stared at the screen so long my coffee turned cold beside me. For a second, my fingers wouldn't move. Then I typed carefully. Yes, still active. 15 minutes later, another notification appeared. Emergency meeting request. Gregory Halbert, Leela Halbert, legal, compliance, Corrine Vare Mercer. I looked up from my desk while people moved quietly through the office, pretending everything was still under control. But the second I saw Robert's name attached to that meeting invite, the entire building suddenly felt smaller.
Chapter 4. The moment their nepotism turned into a legal disaster. Nobody really worked after the emergency meeting invite went out. People pretended to. They stared at spreadsheets too long, refilled coffee they never drank, walked through hallways carrying laptops without actually going anywhere. Halcyon felt like a building waiting for an earthquake. By 8:30 the next morning, the executive conference room already looked wrecked. Empty coffee cups, open legal binders, compliance reports spread across the table like evidence in a homicide case. Kathleen Bishop sat near the far end, flipping through documents so aggressively the paper edges curled under her fingers.
Parker Wynn had two laptops open, while Naomi LeClaire quietly reviewed access logs beside him. Nobody looked rested. Gregory walked in, trying very hard to appear composed. That was the first sign he was scared. Normally, Gregory loved rooms like this. Attention made him stronger, but that morning he kept adjusting his cufflinks and checking his watch every 30 seconds. Lila followed behind him, carrying an expensive leather notebook against her chest. She still looked confused more than worried, like this was some kind of overreaction that would eventually settle down after a few polished conversations. I took my seat near the end of the table without saying anything. Nobody acknowledged me when I sat down, but I noticed something important almost immediately. Nobody acknowledged Lila either. Outside the glass walls, employees kept slowing down while passing the conference room, pretending not to stare inside. At exactly 9 o'clock, the screen at the front of the room flickered on. Robert Fielding appeared, sitting inside a glass office overlooking downtown Boston, gray skyline behind him. No greeting, no small talk, just silence. Then he looked directly at Gregory. Your daughter violated a standing non-disclosure agreement tied to confidential roadmap material. The room froze. Not metaphorically, actually froze. Nobody moved, nobody typed, nobody even touched their coffee. Gregory blinked twice like his brain had temporarily stopped working. I think there's been some misunderstanding here. Robert answered immediately. No, there hasn't. Lila leaned forward nervously. I was only trying to strengthen communication with the client. Robert looked at her with the same expression people use when they discover smoke inside a server room. You should never have contacted me directly. That was the moment panic officially entered the room. Kathleen opened another binder so fast several papers slid onto the floor. Parker stopped typing entirely and stared at Gregory across the table. Gregory cleared his throat. We understood the transition as an internal staffing matter. Robert never even looked away from the camera. The agreement was personal. Silence again. Heavy silence. The kind that presses against your chest. Gregory slowly turned toward me. You never mentioned that. I held his stare calmly. You never asked. For the first time since this whole disaster started, Lila finally looked genuinely scared. Her voice lost some of its confidence. I didn't know there were separate restrictions. Naomi answered before anyone else could. That's exactly the problem. Robert folded his hands together. Clause 3A prohibited third-party communication involving restricted roadmap material without written authorization. Parker finally spoke, and authorization was never transferred. I answered quietly, no, it wasn't. Gregory rubbed both hands across his face. We can fix this. Robert's expression did not change at all. No, Gregory, you can't. The room went still again. Outside the conference room, I noticed two legal assistants hurrying down the hallway carrying stacks of folders. Phones had started ringing non-stop across the executive floor. The building already knew something catastrophic was happening. Then Robert said the sentence that finally broke Gregory completely. You replaced competence with optics. Nobody breathed. Lila stared at the table. Kathleen stopped flipping pages. Even Parker froze. Robert kept going. For 7 years, your company had access to sensitive strategic material because of Corinne, not because of your branding, not because of your leadership presentations, because she understood discretion. I watched Gregory's face carefully after that. The arrogance disappeared first, then the confidence, then finally the realization. Westbridge Dynamics never trusted him. They trusted me. That truth hit him harder than losing the contract. Lila looked toward Gregory like she expected him to fix everything, the way powerful fathers usually do for daughters who have never experienced consequences before. But Gregory had nothing left. I didn't leak anything, she whispered. Robert finally looked at her directly again. You circulated restricted terminology inside internal board preparation material. That alone created exposure. Naomi immediately turned toward Parker. We need a full audit of every access point tied to roadmap documentation. Parker nodded and started typing again fast enough to shake the table slightly. Gregory tried one more time. Robert, this feels extreme. That almost made Robert smile. If merger-related language circulates before legal clearance, you create regulatory exposure, investor exposure, and compliance exposure. This stopped being a staffing issue the moment your daughter accessed protected material. Richard Lane from finance looked physically sick now, one hand pressed against his mouth, the other gripping a calculator he probably stopped reading 10 minutes ago. Lila's mascara had started smudging beneath her eyes. I swear I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Kathleen finally snapped. Intent becomes irrelevant once exposure exists. The room went quiet again, and suddenly I realized nobody was defending Lila anymore. Not Gregory, not legal, not compliance. Nobody. Because the second real liability enters a corporate environment, loyalty disappears almost instantly. Robert leaned slightly closer toward the camera. Westbridge Dynamics is terminating all strategic engagement with Halcyon effective immediately. Richard whispered holy shit under his breath. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Parker stopped typing again. Kathleen looked down at the table like she was already calculating litigation timelines. Only Gregory stayed frozen. You're terminating the account. Robert's voice stayed calm. No, Gregory, I'm terminating trust. That line landed harder than anything he said all morning, because everyone in that room understood he was right. The account had already been dead long before this meeting started. Robert leaned toward me one final time. This conversation now moves to legal counsel. Then the screen went black. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence afterward felt surreal. Then chaos finally broke loose. Phones ringing, compliance instructions, legal questions, executives talking over each other. Outside the conference room, employees openly stared through the glass now. Nobody even pretended not to anymore. Halcyon's strategic group was collapsing in real time. Gregory stayed seated while everyone else moved around him. For the first time in years, he looked small, not powerful, not executive, not polished, just tired. I quietly gathered my notebook and stood up. That pulled Gregory back to reality. Corinne. I stopped near the door. His voice sounded different now, smaller, almost desperate. Can you talk to him? Not Mr. Fielding, him. Like somehow I still had the power to rescue the company after spending months watching them replace me piece by piece. I looked at Gregory for a long moment, then I answered calmly. You stopped listening to the only person he trusted a long time ago. Nobody tried stopping me when I walked out, and behind me, Halcyon Strategic Group finally started falling apart loudly enough for the entire building to hear it.
Chapter 5. They thought I was replaceable until the entire company started falling apart. Nobody inside Halcyon talked about growth anymore after the West Bridge collapse. They talked about exposure, exposure risk, compliance exposure, financial exposure, reputational exposure. The entire company sounded like a law firm preparing for impact. By the next week, conference rooms were permanently occupied by legal teams and compliance auditors. Executives who used to spend mornings arguing about expansion strategy now spent entire days reviewing timestamps and access histories. The energy inside the building felt drained, like everyone had suddenly realized the future they were working toward might not exist anymore. I arrived early every morning, mostly because I could not sleep much anyway. My kitchen counter at home had turned into a graveyard of cold coffee cups and half-finished compliance notes. Some nights I fell asleep fully dressed on the couch with my laptop still open beside me. The exhaustion finally started catching up to me after the adrenaline wore off. But oddly enough, underneath the exhaustion, I also felt lighter.
For the first time in months, I was no longer walking into work wondering what piece of myself I would have to quietly swallow before the day ended. Gregory almost never left his office anymore. The glass walls that once made him look important now made him look trapped. Every time I passed by, he seemed older than the day before. His expensive suits suddenly looked too big on him somehow, like confidence had been holding the fabric together more than tailoring ever did. Charisma can carry a man surprisingly far in corporate America, right until lawyers start asking for documentation. Lila barely spoke to anyone at all. Her client access had been revoked pending investigation. Security temporarily deactivated her executive badge while compliance reviewed every roadmap file she had touched during the transition. The same executives who once called her the future of leadership now avoided even standing near her too long. One afternoon, I saw her sitting alone near the break room, staring at her phone while conversations quietly shifted away from her, like people were afraid liability might spread through proximity. Nobody sat beside her. Nobody asked if she was all right. Corporate loyalty disappears very quickly once careers become endangered. Part of me almost pitied her. Then I remembered how easily she stepped into a life she never understood while treating years of my work like inherited property. By then, Halcyon had started turning against itself completely. Marketing blamed executive leadership for bypassing review procedures, legal blamed Gregory for overriding concerns, finance blamed everyone. Executives whispered in hallways, trying to figure out who would survive the fallout. The company felt less like a business and more like a group of people slowly realizing the ship had already hit something fatal underneath the waterline. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. I spent most of those days organizing records, meeting summaries, approval chains, archived communication, client escalation timelines. Not because I wanted revenge, because panic makes corporations dishonest, and when companies become afraid, they start searching for people to sacrifice. Naomi Leclerc stopped by my office late one evening, carrying a thick stack of audit folders. She looked exhausted. I honestly don't think this place survives the year without major restructuring. I leaned back slowly in my chair. I think everybody knows that already. She glanced toward Gregory's office through the glass wall. For what it's worth, people are finally realizing how much of this company was actually being held together by you. That hit harder than I expected. Not because it felt good, because it came years too late. After she left, I sat alone, staring out across the Chicago skyline while snow drifted slowly beyond the windows. Almost every light on the executive floor was still on after 9 at night. Nobody wanted to go home anymore. Going home meant being alone with consequences. The emergency board meeting happened that Friday. Nobody made small talk while taking their seats. Denise Holloway chaired the meeting from the far end of the table, with a binder thick enough to look permanent. Her voice stayed calm while reading the findings. Non-disclosure breach, unauthorized roadmap exposure, compromised merger confidentiality, material non-public information risk. Every phrase landed heavier than the one before it. Gregory sat near the middle of the table, staring down at his hands. No polished speeches, no motivational leadership tone, no executive confidence. Just a tired man finally understanding that arrogance has a price. Lila sat beside outside counsel with swollen eyes and yesterday's makeup still faintly visible beneath them. She looked young for the first time since I met her. Not ambitious, not impressive, just young. Halfway through the meeting, one of the board members turned toward me. "Corinne, if restructuring happens, would you consider remaining with Halcyon?" The room became completely silent after that. I looked around slowly. At the conference table where I spent nearly 10 years cleaning up problems nobody else wanted attached to their names. At the executives who suddenly valued my judgment only after everything collapsed. At Gregory, who still could not fully look me in the eye. Then I answered honestly. "No, I think this company got too comfortable believing I would always stay. Nobody argued with me, because everyone in that room knew it was true. Gregory finally looked up then. There was nothing powerful left in his expression anymore, just regret, and maybe embarrassment, because deep down, he understood the worst part of this was not losing Westbridge. It was realizing the person he spent months replacing was the only reason the account survived as long as it did. The meeting ended quietly after that. No dramatic speeches, no cinematic breakdowns. Most corporate collapses rarely happen that way. Most of the time, they happen under fluorescent lighting, while exhausted people stare at paperwork, realizing they destroyed something they thought would always survive them. I packed my office that same afternoon. A few notebooks, family photos, old conference badges, almost 10 years of my life fitting into one cardboard box. As I walked through the office carrying it, people suddenly looked at me differently. Not invisible anymore. Now they looked ashamed. The elevator ride down felt strangely peaceful. Outside, downtown Chicago was freezing and loud and full of traffic pushing through dirty snow. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket while I stood near the curb, staring up at Halcyon one last time. Aaron Whittemore, still interested in talking. For years, I thought companies stayed successful because charismatic executives stood at the top making important decisions. Turns out, most companies survive because exhausted, invisible people quietly keep everything from falling apart while nobody notices. I smiled for what felt like the first genuine time in weeks. Then I typed back, "Yes, I think I finally am." I slipped my phone back into my pocket and started walking without looking behind me. And if you've ever spent years holding everything together while people around you treated your loyalty like something permanent, then you already understand this better than most. Some people only recognize your value after their own arrogance destroys the very thing you were protecting the entire time.